I'm a big fan of Bart Ehrman's book, Forged. So
me too.
So Richard, if you want to comment on that book.
Yeah. Well, Forged is the pop market version, right? So I recommend it. It's great. It's basically the book is about what we all take for granted in biblical studies, but most people aren't told, which is that there are tons of books in the Bible that are forgeries. And there are tons of other books that Christians forged in addition in the early centuries. Actually, forgery was literally the most common literary activity of Christians in the first 3 centuries. Tons of forgeries that they made. And there's often has been throughout the 20th century, this apologetical assumption, this claim that, well, forgery, no one really thought forgery was bad. Like it was just, they're writing, everybody understood that you were writing in the name of a person, that you weren't really pretending to be them. And therefore, it was completely on the up and up, and there's nothing wrong with it. And then Ehrman researched this and found tons of evidence that that's completely false. That everybody was condemning forgery. Forgery was definitely regarded back then as something you're not supposed to do, and people were definitely doing it to try and fool people into thinking that they had the authority of the names that they were putting in these books. And so he documents this thoroughly. There's some great stories in there. There's like examples of Galen. Galen, this medical scientist, wrote this whole entire treatise called On My Own Books because he was so angry at people forging books in his name. And so he wrote a book basically explaining, these are my books, and this is how you tell my books from these forgeries, and really condemns these forgers for what they're doing. Ehrman quotes that guy and various others, and tons of evidence on this. It's really good. Plus, he summarizes what the mainstream biblical scholars know is why we conclude many of these books are forgeries. So, like, why do we think the pastoral epistles are not written by Paul? For example, why do we think various other epistles were not written by Paul? Why do we think there's only 7 authentic epistles of Paul in the New Testament, and so on? So people who want that book is a really great one. But if you really want to have like the detailed, scholarly, peer-reviewed version of that with footnotes and bibliographies and the whole thing, Forgery and Counter-Forgery is the other book he wrote, which is the official scholarly version of Forged. The Forged is the easy read. It's the quick one if you want to get the summary.
It's like a popular.
Yeah, it's the popular one. It's good. It's very good. But if you really want that like heavy, detailed, scholarly version of it, Forgery and Counter-Forgery is the title of the other book that he wrote. And they're both excellent books and have contributed significantly to the field. So that's an example of something that he's doing that I really like.
Bob, if you have comments on Forged.
The only hesitation I have, and it's not much of one, is this reminds me of the ancient debate over homosexuality. It's from, I think, Robin Scrogg's book, Homosexuality in the New Testament. He goes through loads of ancient comments about it, and he says that a whole lot of people said this is immoral and unnatural, and that had to do mainly with pederasty, not quite the same thing we're talking about when it's debated today, but that you can find about as many comments of people defending it. If you read only one group or the other, you would think this must have been the ancient consensus, but there wasn't. It was a huge debate like today. And I wonder, like, you can show that a lot of people opposed forgery, but what we would need to know and cannot know is the people that did the forgery, were they thinking like that today's apologists say that, well, of course, I'm not trying to tell anybody I am James the Just or Enoch. It's just part of the fiction, like Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars books. He says, well, I know Captain Carter, and he's told me his adventures. Burroughs doesn't expect you to believe that's literally true. It's part of the shtick. And I'm not sure that the forgers were like fiends saying, well, I'm going to sucker these poor jerks. But it would be surprising if they did. It's just we don't really know, and it gets into the intentional fallacy, so-called. Can you really read the mind? It's like the implied author versus the real author. So I think that slightly qualifies it, but even what I'm saying is speculation. He really does amass loads of evidence, and he certainly shows this wasn't, the consensus of opinion that, oh yeah, forgery is fine. He really does make a real impact with that book.
We have one example, though, of what you were talking about, where 2 Thessalonians calls 1 Thessalonians a forgery and says you're not supposed to, don't listen to that because it's a forgery. That author is telling us that he wants you to believe that he's the real Paul, and that forgeries are bad. And
yes, that's right.
So we do sometimes get a peek into the mind of the author.
Yeah, 2 Peter is obviously priestcraft also.
Right, yeah.
And they just do a bad job. You remember when your apostles told you, oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be one of them.
Yeah, that's another good example.
It's a great book, and I think it's terrific.
Well, 2 Peter's one where there were these Christians who were basically saying the Gospels were myths, that they're cleverly constructed myths, and so someone forged a letter in Peter's name claiming, no, they're not myths, I was there, and then forges an entire experience with Jesus. I met Jesus at this, that tells a little story about how he met Jesus. And so, that's an example of where they really want you to believe this is Peter.
Yes.
And they're trying to use that fact to try and argue you out of this other position so you can condemn these other Christians that we know nothing else about. Like, all their literature is destroyed. We don't know who these other Christians were. All we get is this one, rebuttal to this fake letter that's a rebuttal to them. That's all we get to hear because everything else was destroyed. So there's a lot we can learn from forgeries. That's another example. So.
Okay.